Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at a brief history of Great Britain. Now, it's a 20-minute long video. Yeah, I'm hoping it's a nice 6,500 years condensed video, because it'd be interesting to see how much of the history of the Isles that I actually know. But yeah, let's get right into this.
The United Kingdom is a nation located in the British Isles, made up of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
I knew that.
Thousands of years ago, the Isles were inhabited by long-forgotten pre-Celtic people, known as the Beaker culture, named for their distinctive pottery beakers. Little is known of them, but it has been suggested that these people laid the foundations for the mysterious Stonehenge, a series of heavy standing stones which were transported from 150 miles away and arranged to form a calendar, marking the...
Sorry, I just noticed it says up there 2,500 BCE. Does that make it circa 4,500? Apologies, I thought Stonehenge was 4,500 BC. I guess I was wrong, but it's interesting that, isn't it? You know, you've got a group of peoples, the Beaker peoples, because they found clay beakers, clay vessels, and because they found remnants of that culture, they assume that this culture built all these megalithic structures. And I don't see that. No, what's interesting as well, if you look to the right on the megalithics on Stonehenge there, which I've been to visit a couple of times, to be fair, I'd highly recommend anyone go and visit it. It's really peaceful there, it's nice. The pillar second from right, is it just me, or does that look like a teak cut stone from Göbekli Tepe? But I digress. I'll go back a touch. So yeah, I thought that was 6,500 years old. Guess I was wrong.
Stones which were transported from 150 miles away and arranged to form a calendar, marking the days of the summer and winter solstice. Over time, waves of Celtic-speaking people arrived from the European continent, who soon came to form the Brittonic, Gaelic and Pictish people. These people were not a unified people, but were rather many tribes who shared a similar pagan religion, language and culture. The Romans invaded, conquering what's now England and Wales, but failed to conquer the Pictish tribes to the north.
So let's go back a quick touch there. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, look how much of that landmass the Roman Empire occupied, but yeah, just north of Italy, just north of Italy, all this area was known as Celt, Gaulish, Germanic territories. And it's interesting, you know, the size of that area compared to Italy, and you know, no wonder Italy was never actually fully able to dominate Central Europe. I mean, they tried a number of times, obviously, and then you had Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire occupied Francia and stuff. But yeah, and it's interesting that, like, you know, the Roman Empire technically did survive. If you go into any major city in the Western Hemisphere, even as far as India, even Japan, I believe, there's neoclassical architecture on like government buildings and things like that, even in India. So yeah, like the Roman Empire, they survived till today, in essence.
To conquer the Pictish tribes to the north. The Romans launched several campaigns into this land they called Caledonia. However, their fortifications were soon overrun and abandoned, and they retreated to Hadrian's Wall. Their conquered lands were incorporated into the Roman Empire, becoming the province of Britannia. They brought Roman customs and laws, improved infrastructure and connected many towns and cities with Roman roads. When the Romans left, there was a great migration of Germanic tribes. These were the Jutes, Angles and Saxons, with their language Old English. Their settlement pushed many Britons.
So I just to say as well, do you know this area, all these Celtic tribes, if you go and follow the work of Yari, I'll actually put a link in the description below, because I'd love more people to go and check this guy's channel out. He talks about how the lost tribes of Israel moved into Germania and all the way across, and the Jutes, the Angles, Saxons, Frisians, these were actually tribes of Israel, believe it or not. I mean, I don't know whether that's the gospel or not, but he's managed to do a map and track the migration through the holy books, you know, the scriptures.
With their language Old English. Their settlement pushed many Britons to areas in Wales, Brittany and a kingdom known as Dumnonia, while Scotland eventually evolved into 4 kingdoms. The smallest of these were the Scots, who were originally from Ireland, the Britons of Strathclyde, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Bernicia and the Picts of Alba. For unknown reasons, the Jutes disappeared from history, but the Angles and Saxons eventually formed 7 kingdoms. Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia and Bernicia became Northumbria. After the collapse of Dumnonia, the remaining territory of Cornwall fought against the powerful kingdom of Wessex. Cornwall eventually fell under the control of Wessex, but it managed to keep its own culture. Wales at this point was also made up of several separate kingdoms.
Sorry, yeah. See, this area in red at the bottom, this is obviously Wessex. Now, we're probably going to come on to this in a minute, but just north of there's a little area here, and obviously King Alfred came from Wessex, and he became King of England. But Ethelstan, there's a little town called Malmesbury, just around here where the mouse cursor is. Now, he was the son of Alfred, who went on to have what was known as the bloodiest battle in Great Britain. Now, when you think about the Romans, when they came over, they had a conflict with Boudicca, who's the wife of a king who was murdered. She was raped and things like this, all that nasty stuff. And she managed to raise a force allegedly of 100,000 men, chariots and all, and took on like 6,000 legions. So that's 106,000 strong, allegedly. So that must have been one hell of a bloody battle. So if Ethelstan's conflict, which unified England and Scotland, where he fought three or four different factions, apparently that must have been over 100,000 people or so. So it's amazing, you know, you think that far back, over 1,000 years, the size of the conflicts that were taking place, even way over in, you know, Alexander the Great, and when he fought, was it Darius or something, and he had like 40,000 or something. It's crazy numbers. So much death and destruction.
The largest being Gwynedd in the north, Powys in the east and Dyfed to the south. The British Isles soon saw numerous Norse raiders from Scandinavia. These were the Vikings, and they began settlement on many of the Scottish Isles, the Isle of Man, and they even founded the city of Dublin in Ireland. The Scots and the Picts then decided to unite under Kenneth MacAlpine to form the Kingdom of Alba. The Kingdom of Alba grew strong over the years, and eventually Strathclyde was brought into the fold. Meanwhile, Danish Vikings arrived in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for conquest. After fighting the King of Wessex, Alfred the Great.
Sorry, just to touch on that, when I mentioned about the tribes of Israel as well, apparently there's old maps stating that Denmark was called Dan, and the people who settled there were of the tribe of Dan, moving from when they were evicted out of the Holy Land after it was one of the Eastern kings. I don't think it was Babylonia. I think Babylonia had been destroyed at this point. And yeah, the migration, again, I'll put a link in the description below, just if anyone is interested in that.
The Danelaw was formed, a land where the laws of the Danes held influence over the Anglo-Saxons, controlling the region and its affairs. The Anglo-Saxons eventually defeated the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, and Athelstan became the first king of the English. Although, the newly formed Kingdom of Denmark would conquer England and even found a short-lived Danish dynasty under Canute. The Norsemen had a dramatic impact on the Isles, so it's no wonder some words in the English language have Norse origin. After defeating formidable sea raiders from Ireland, the Western Isles, Scandinavia and Anglo-Saxon forces from Mercia, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn subdued his rivals in southwest Wales. Llywelyn became the only Welsh king ever to rule over the entire territory of Wales.
I did not know that there was a unified King of Wales, which, there you go, he just said there, he was the only one to do it. It's fascinating that, because not long after this, obviously, what year is that, 1059, was just before the Battle of Hastings. So round about now, you've probably got Harold Godwinson, I think his name is, Godfrey Godwinson. He actually ends up taking the throne of England after having an arrangement with William the Conqueror. He comes up north around this area, has a battle with one of the Vikings who came over. It was actually known as the last great king of the Vikings, I believe, even though technically Harold himself was a Viking. Yeah, Harold won that conflict against another Harold, comes back down south collecting forces along the way, and then as his final conflict, that was it the Battle of Stamford, or was that the one up north? I can't remember now. But yeah, and then he has this final standoff with William the Conqueror, who, as we know, goes on to win the conflict. But interestingly enough about that as well, was that Harold actually held longer than people thought. It wasn't until part of his front line charged William and broke ranks that William was able to flank around him and get into Harold's forces. But even then, Harold retreated up the hill, allegedly, aimed his halbert and his royal guard, probably, made the last stance until Harold was shot in the eye. But if they'd have made it till the next morning, there would have been sufficient troops and supplies that would have been provided to Harold that he probably would have beat William the Conqueror. So that one stray arrow into the eye, changed the course of history.
He was defeated by the English Earl Harold Godwinson and killed by his own men, leading to the Welsh kingdoms splitting apart once more. At the death of Edward the Confessor, there was a succession dispute between four claimants. Harold Godwinson was elected as king, and managed to defend England from an invasion by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. However, Harold had to march his armies south to defend against Duke William of Normandy, who had crossed the English Channel. According to tradition, at the Battle of Hastings, Harold was killed by an arrow to the eye, and the Norman invaders were victorious. The new King William defeated a number of rebellions, built a new design of castles called moat and baileys, and introduced a number of reforms, like trial by combat and the Doomsday.
Wow, I was going to say something there, but that's even better. Look at that, 1066, that's what, 1,000 years, nearly exactly 1,000 years ago, 1,042 years ago. Now, just think, the pyramids were built 4,500 years ago, excuse me, and it took over 3,500 years before we reached the point where, in England, it became law to have trial by combat. It's incredible, that.
Doomsday Book. The Norman dynasty invaded into South.
And the Doomsday Book, if people are unaware, was obviously, it was a charter for every plot of land, every head of cattle, all basically the value of the nation at that time. It was quite a revolutionary document as well. Not as revolutionary as Magna Carta, which made the king subservient to the laws of the land. People had the right of trial and things like that. That was massive on a global stage. Obviously, the Americans then streamlined the process and made it more constitutional, by getting some of the dead weight out of there and made the words a lot more stronger.
Wales and parts of Ireland, creating the Lordship of Ireland. At court, nobles spoke and conducted sessions in the Anglo-Norman language, which endured for centuries and left an incredible mark in development of modern English. After a brief civil war, Henry II would marry Eleanor of Aquitaine, establishing the Angevin Empire, beginning a long rivalry against France. Richard the Lionheart defended much of this territory and also became a central Christian commander during the Third Crusade.
The reason he became a rival for France, because, as you said, they started the Angevin line of kings, where in France at the time, I don't even believe it was called Frankie at this point. They had something called the Merovingian bloodline, so that's where that rivalry came into it.
Achieving considerable victories against his Muslim counterpart, Saladin. Under King John, heavy taxes were imposed on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. The barons rebelled and forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a charter that established the principle that everyone was subject to the law, even the king, guaranteeing the rights of individuals, the right to justice, and the...
That was probably the most powerful document ever produced, because without this document we wouldn't have had all the subsequent documents that came along.
Right to a fair trial. Most of North Wales remained independently ruled by several Welsh princes until 1216, when Llewellyn the Great became the ruler of the Principality of Wales. This would be the case until Edward I, who conquered Wales in 1284, effectively becoming part of England. At the death of King Alexander III, Scotland was left with 14 rivals for succession. To prevent civil war, the Scottish magnates asked Edward I of England to elect a claimant. John Balliol was elected king, but was constantly undermined by Edward, who opposed Scottish independence. Edward decided to launch several campaigns to conquer Scotland and depose King John, to which he acquired the nickname Hammer of the Scots. Under a brave Scottish knight, William Wallace, the Scots...
William Wallace is shown here with a bow and arrow, and the king is shown with a broken sword. It's like we've got Legolas and Aragorn over here. What's going on? The sword of Elendil.
Mounted resistance against the English, defeating them at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Edward marched north in person and defeated Wallace in battle, but Wallace managed to escape. He was later captured and executed, but his efforts allowed Robert the Bruce to rise up and defeat the English, securing Scottish independence. When the King of France died without an heir, Edward III was technically eligible to the crown, through his mother. The French court denied his claim and instead installed Philip of Valois. Edward paid homage to Philip as he owned the lands of Gascony and was essentially a vassal to the King of France. Due to disagreements, Edward reasserted his claim to the throne and invaded France, beginning the 100 Years' War.
What's interesting with England and France is that obviously the conflict had always been raging. Oh my god, what is going on there? Looks like this poor guy down in the middle here has been impaled through his crotch area, and the spear has gone all the way through, has it, into the next man, who's also being sniped between his eyes. Wow, it's brutal, that. Excuse me, but yet the battle between France and Great Britain, obviously he's just referenced the 100 Years' War, it was a continuation. Great Britain and France just seemed to always be at war for some reason or another, and it wasn't until like the invention of the longbow, I think England invented the longbow, and once that came in, you know, it was game over really. I don't think France ever won a conflict against us after that, but yeah, it's fascinating though, like England, France, again there was all these tribes, but we're all like the same peoples. It's amazing how there was so much conflict, like for so long.
The English achieved notable victories at the Battle of Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt thanks to the technical superiority of the longbow, but was unable to conquer the French with the appearance of Joan of Arc, who lifted the French spirit and turned the tide of the war. Upon the death of Edward III, an entire generation was skipped in the line of succession, which prompted bitter rivalry between several claimants. Most notably were the houses of York and Lancaster. Tensions were high until a bloody age of warfare erupted between these two factions in the Wars of the Roses. It's so in-depth and complicated, this period will likely become a video of its own.
He's right there, it is very complicated, but what's fascinating about that is you've got the author J.R.R. Martin, not Tolkien, the one who did Game of Thrones and stuff. I remember watching an interview with him a few years back, and he was talking about like how the Wars of the Roses and like English and European medieval history was such a major influence, because although there was war and death, there was also romance and, you know, chivalry and all this kind of stuff involved. Interesting story, really.
The wars ended with the arrival of the Tudor Dynasty, Henry VIII wanting a divorce split with the church creating his own Church of England. This ultimately led to a series of religious differences between future English monarchs. In between his 6 wives and naval adventures, Henry gave Wales representation in Parliament and created...
Sorry, I wonder how many people actually studied this in school.
And created the Kingdom of Ireland, but realistically he only controlled an...
Oh, it's gone there. I was going to see how many people could name the wives of Henry VIII. Catherine and Aragon, I've seen that one.
Area known as the Pale. In addition, Henry's paranoia and suspicion amounted to tens of thousands of executions, including his friends and wives. During the 16th century, the largest and most powerful empire was Spain, under King Philip II. England, under Elizabeth I, were helping Dutch rebels reject Spanish rule, and many English privateers were also intercepting Spanish silver on its journey back from the New World. This angered the Spanish king, and the final straw came when Elizabeth had Mary Queen of Scots executed, because she did not want Scotland falling under Catholicism. The Spanish Armada, consisting of 130 ships, was deployed to invade England. At the Battle of...
Because as you know, England actually split from the Roman Catholic Church just before Elizabeth.
Armada, consisting of 130 ships, was deployed to invade England. At the Battle of Gravelines, an English victory forced the Spanish fleet to sail around the British Isles before storms in the north of Scotland destroyed the remaining ships. In retaliation, the English, led by Sir Francis Drake, amassed their own armada to invade Spain, but this too became a failed endeavour. Born in this period, William Shakespeare became a renowned poet, playwright and actor, who contributed significantly to English literature. When Queen Elizabeth of England died without an heir, her closest male relative was James VI of Scotland. James was elected as King of England and Scotland in a personal union. Although the countries remained...
Look at that. That's got to be one of the only points in British and Irish history where all islands were united. And what year is that? 1603. So like 400 years ago. And it'll probably never be united again.
Remained separate political entities. As the first monarch to rule the entire island of Great Britain, several assassination attempts were made by Catholic conspirators. One such assassination attempt was the gunpowder plot by Guy Fawkes, who tried to blow up Parliament. After a failed colony...
You just imagine that in modern times. I mean, we're living in a world now that's so polarising, first left, first right. And just, you know, that was like an act of terrorism back then. That's what they'd call it today, wouldn't they? But yeah, it's amazing. I wonder how many people actually... Sorry about that. I wonder how many...
assassination attempts were made by Catholic conspirators. One such assassination attempt was the gunpowder plot by Guy Fawkes, who tried to blow up Parliament. After a failed colony known as Roanoke, England established a successful colony known as Jamestown, which would eventually...
Excuse me, so here we go. England became Britain, it's moved in Europe, sweeping around Africa now, and then going across into the Americas.
Eventually evolve into the 13 colonies. At first, expeditions to the New World were mainly driven by religious motives, which were predominantly to convert the natives to their faith. But colonies became more profitable, as demand for New World crops like tobacco and sugar increased. British ships also made a monopoly on the transportation of captive African slaves that crossed the Atlantic to the Americas.
Yeah, I've recently watched a video about the slave trade and stuff. And in fact, I might do a review on it, to be fair. And in the video, it showed you that the Portuguese actually moved the most slaves around. I think it was around 16 million. And I do believe Britain was second with around 10 or 12 million. But it goes to show you, you know, it wasn't just because when I thought of the slave trade, I used to always think of just Great Britain, because we've got a museum in Liverpool town centre, and it discusses the slave trade, because obviously there's a lot of slaves came through the ports of Liverpool, and yeah, it's fascinating that when you look into it, you realise like the slave trade was so big. You know, it was so big inside Africa. I think there was something around. I think it was a report of around 60 million Africans was slaves in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, and they used to castrate the slaves so that they couldn't breed. You know, so the line of then there, you know, didn't have to worry about children, relationships, and all that. It was just they'd take them, castrate them. You were a slave until you die. It's disgusting, really. And this is a really dark chapter in human history. Obviously, slavery has always been a big thing. You know, it's been around forever, right across the world, all races, all creeds, all religions. But the commercialisation of it around this time, it's a dark stain in human history. It really is.
Millions of Africans were shipped in cramped, horrific conditions to work on brutal plantations in the Americas, and essentially became property to their masters. For 300 years this practice continued in the British Empire until it was fully abolished in 1833. This period also saw a wave of plantations in Ireland, where Irish lands were confiscated and given to English and Scottish settlers. Tensions would rise between Charles I and Parliament. Following disagreements, conflicts between royal and parliamentary authority within England led to the English Civil War. The
English Civil War. This was a massive conflict in Great Britain. But I just wanted to touch back there. You know, when you talk about the slaves coming from Africa and things like that, it was around about, maybe fast forward a few years, but a lot of the Irish ended up migrating over to the Americas. And they actually sold themselves into slavery. It was called indentured servitude, where they would give themselves up, work like free labour, unpaid labour, for accommodation really, and a potential trade, but most importantly to get on the boat to go to the New World. And it's like an old wives' tale, isn't it? You know, the Irish built New York and Boston and things like that, but there's actually an element of truth in there. But sorry, yeah, back to the Civil War. Oliver Cromwell, King James.
Authority within England led to the English Civil War. The country became divided between parliamentarians, known as the Roundheads, and royalists, known as the Cavaliers. Under Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army, the parliamentarians defeated Charles and executed him for treason. Cromwell became Lord Protector and dissolved the monarchy, but shortly after his death it was restored under Charles II. Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, and when she arrived from Portugal, she introduced the greatest beverage of all time.
Tea.
Tea. Tea had been used by China for centuries, but its arrival in the 17th century captured the interest of the English aristocracy, and soon captivated every other Englishman.
We do like our
In
tea.
1685, a Catholic James II became king in a largely Protestant nation. James's daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William were both Protestant, and many nobles unhappy with the Catholic king invited William to become king. William found considerable support when he invaded, and he was soon crowned King William III in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. Although William's supporters dominated the government, there remained a significant following for James II in the Scottish Highlands. Clan MacDonald of Glencoe was one such group who had not been prompt in pledging allegiance to the new.
That Clan MacDonald, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure there's an island in the middle of a lake in Scotland. My father went there a few years ago, and they were on canoes, kayaks, going around this lake, or a loch might have been, excuse me, and there was tombs on there, there was burials. I'm pretty sure they were of a MacDonald clan, who were quite well known for being anti-English and things like that. And I just wondered if that's the same clan.
Monarch. For this reason alone, 38 members of the clan were murdered in what became known as the Massacre of Glencoe. After Scotland's failed colonial endeavours in Nova Scotia and Panama, and an economic crisis in the 1690s, there was a union between England and Scotland, forming the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The House of Stuart had ruled Britain for just over a century, but ended with the death of Queen Anne. Sophia of Hanover was the granddaughter of James I, and her son George became king. Great Britain soon found itself drawn into several European wars, most notable being the War of the Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War. Victories in these wars resulted in territory for the Empire, particularly in North America, although it
just goes to show you, at this time, England, France, Spain, Holland, Portugal, these were, on a global scale, pretty small nations, and the influence that they had on a global scale, it's virtually unmeasurable, like the good and the bad, really, to be honest.
Resulted in territory for the Empire, particularly in North America, although it resulted in considerable debt. In order to make up for this debt, King George III ordered heavy taxes be placed on the 13 colonies. This, among other reasons, culminated into the American War of Independence, and with financial help from France and Spain, the Americans were victorious. The East India Company, which was founded by Elizabeth I, had grown rapidly, and even operated its own military and controlled a sizable amount of territory. The company had set up fortified warehouses where they traded with many Indian rulers, acquiring important luxuries like textiles and spices.
Yeah, obviously, India was known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Look at the size of it, and the population today of over 1 billion people. That was how Britain managed to control a populace that big. Well, I know how, because we went straight to capitals and cultural centres and took over them places. Once you occupy those areas, then people tend to throw the weapons on the floor. But yeah, it's amazing the size of India, and we were able to control it. Well, my ancestors were.
One of the most important cities of all was Bengal, as it had a large taxable population. The governor of Bengal, Robert Clive, ordered that the population grow opium to export to China, instead of growing food, as it proved to be a great source of income. However, when a famine struck, it resulted in the deaths of millions of people. Meanwhile, Captain James Cook arrived at New Zealand and the southeast coast of Australia, although he wasn't the first to discover the area because of past Portuguese and Dutch explorers. However, unlike the Dutch and Portuguese, Britain claimed it as their new penal colony, known as New South Wales, with the first convicts arriving in 1778. A new threat.
1A, take 1.
What's your favorite browser extension?
Online shopping is easy.
Threat had emerged from France, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte.
Obviously, he was a very inspired man, Napoleon. Look at all the land he conquered. To be honest, it was probably the Navy. It was our British Navy. Obviously, we were a can of sardines, if you will, and we developed our Navy to the point where we became masters of building ships, we became masters of the sea. Ergo, Britannia rules the waves, as it was back then. And this is going to lead on to the Great Battle of Waterloo, which throughout the battles of history, I'm not going to say it's my favourite battle, because obviously that just sounds weird, having a favourite battle, but in context of what happened and the Prussians, the way they arrived just in time, and the taking of the farmhouse, the defensive squares, what a battle that was in terms of like advancements and like generals trying to outdo each other. It was great. Not great for the death, I just mean, tactically.
Napoleon had come to dominate most of Europe, but Britain's advantage was that she was an island, and the Royal Navy had become a major force at sea. Invasion of Britain was near impossible, and in a series of coalitions Napoleon was defeated. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was growing rapidly into a superpower based on their supremacy of naval engineering. Furthermore, in Ireland the Great Famine struck. A disease killing...
Sorry, this is the potato famine. So what's this, around 1845? So this is when you'd already had migrating people from Ireland to Americas, but this is where you got mass migrations from Ireland into places like Liverpool and Wales and Morecambe, even into Scotland, just getting across the sea into the UK, and then others who migrated to the New World.
Potato plants. Ireland, which had merged with Britain, relied heavily on this crop for food, but the British government forced Ireland to export what little food they had to other areas. Without any aid or food, Ireland's population plummeted by half due to starvation and emigration to countries like the United States. Things weren't looking so great in India either, as India was rebelling against company rule. The East India Company had employed many Indian soldiers known as sepoys, who were under the command of British soldiers. These sepoys grew increasingly unhappy, and a revolt soon occurred. Yet it quickly failed due to a lack of unity between Indians. After
That was it. That was like the strength of Britain as well. It wasn't just the navy, but it was the professionalism of their army. And you think about it, you know, all these countries that Great Britain went into. I've mentioned about neoclassical architecture and things like that you can find in India today. You know, it wasn't just the military aspect of what the empire brought into these kind of countries. It was the infrastructure. You know, you heard about the Doomsday Book, you know, mapping out the value of things and heads of population, taxes, reforms and all this kind of stuff, Magna Cartas, laws. You know, Britain exported that into most of these nations that they conquered. So like I say, I mean, the level of reach that happened from these imperial powers back in the last millennium, you know, it's incredible.
Due to a lack of unity between Indians. After the rebellion, the British government took direct control, with Queen Victoria being declared Empress of India. During the 19th century, the world was forever changed by the Industrial Revolution. Society was transformed by technological advances and increasing mechanisation, and would launch Britain to global dominance. Some of the greatest innovations and inventions were the sewing machine, the fire extinguisher, steam-powered engines and turbines, the electric motor and photography. The telegraph was also a major invention, as a message could now be sent from Britain to India in a matter of hours. The establishment of railways and trains also
Sorry again, but it's just interesting the timing, isn't it? Because without the empire being in place, maybe they wouldn't have had the wealth and the peacetime in Great Britain itself for the people to like study and make advancements and breakthroughs in technology. But again, because the empire infrastructure was there, once the advancements had been made, they were just exported globally, you know, around the world. And I know I'm British and that, but it seems like the British Empire helped level up the whole planet in terms of technology, society, reforms and all that kind of stuff. Obviously there was a lot of negativity that came with it. I'm not blind to that, but again, it's fascinating and incredible.
Transformed transport forever. Instead of travelling days by horse and carriage, it now only took a matter of hours by train. Engineering and communication advances not only united the empire, they triggered a manufacturing boom like no other. People flocked from rural areas to city centres for jobs. Productivity reached an all-time high, but the consequences of mass migration resulted in extremely cramped and polluted cities. However,
So if you just look on the left of the screen here, here's a perfect example of neoclassical architecture. Now, most of these buildings, they'll be brick with cladding on the outside. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is all cladding around brickwork. But it's the fact that, you know, this neoclassical architecture is so prevalent in Great Britain and around the empire. Like I say, it's like the Roman Empire never died.
Extremely cramped and polluted cities. However, with these problems that were generated, it resulted in an improved sewage system. Newcastle focused on shipbuilding, Manchester the cotton industry, Liverpool became a major trading centre, Middlesbrough fixated itself on iron and steel works, the presence of iron ore, limestone and large coal deposits in the West Midlands and South East Wales prompted the establishment of ironworks, and Scotland boomed in the linen industry. The Victorian era also saw a major change in society, as families from the poorest backgrounds gained access to education, although it was much stricter than today's standards. The 1860s also saw the rise of the greatest food combination ever: fish and chips. Towards the end of the 19th century, European powers came together at the Berlin Conference to divide.
Can I just say though, not all Brits love fish and chips. I'll be one of them people. I'm more of a pie and chips kind of guy.
Conference to divide Africa between them. A group in South Africa known as the Boers, who were originally Dutch settlers, proved difficult for the British.
Sorry, yeah, and you know, there's a lot made up of the fact that, you know, post Second World War, Great Britain had a large immigration policy where they were just bringing as many people in from around the empire and the Commonwealth as they could, places like India, etc. Now, people think that's just because of the Second World War. It was actually the depopulation of the Second World War, the First World War, the Second Boer War, and the First Boer War, which all took place within 100 years or so. So that's 4 really big wars, which like basically dwindled down the population of Great Britain. Now, the Second Boer War actually had the largest ever British overseas forces. I think we sent something like 250 to 500,000 men from the British Isles to fight in this conflict. And another fascinating fact about the Boer War is the Boers, they actually, I don't know if they had superior rifles or not. I mean, I'm guessing they didn't, but they had superior shots and accuracy, and they were able to hit British troops from a further distance. So, you know, that war was a crazy one. And another fact as well, which is another stain on British history and the history of the world, was that while the Transvaal and the Orange States were fighting the Boers away from home, Brits went in and took the women and children from the settlements and put them in basically like concentration camps, and a number of them died due to starvation and stuff like that. So again, you know, as much as there was good things that came from the empire, there was some absolutely disgusting and abominable things that happened as well, and that should never have happened. But yeah.
The Boers lived in 2 nations, the Free Orange States and the Republic of Transvaal, and both resisted British rule using guerrilla warfare. To counter this, the British placed many women and children in their tens of thousands into concentration camps, where many died from starvation and disease. Britain became a major player in the First World War, and many men proudly volunteered to...
Sorry, I'm glad you mentioned that in this video about the women and children in the concentration camps, because some people like to try and gloss over that part of history, but like I say, it's hopefully, I'd like to say lessons could be learned, but obviously Hitler is about to go into the First and Second World War. Obviously, people didn't learn.
Britain became a major player in the First World War, and many men proudly volunteered to serve and protect their country. The Great War, as it was called, saw the use of new technology, such as dreadnoughts, warplanes, artillery, machine guns, grenades, chemical weapons, bolt-action rifles, and the first use of the tank. Many faced horrific conditions in the trenches and witnessed gruesome battles.
Sorry, I've actually seen that tank in the tank museum, and I tell you what, when you see that, it is frightening. And I can only imagine what it must have been like back then. You know, people weren't as used to mechanised machinery as we are now, and you know, the floor vibrating off horses was bad enough back in the day. Imagine this coming at you, firing large bullets and projectiles at you as well, just running people over. Must have been terrifying.
Tank. Many faced horrific conditions in the trenches and witnessed gruesome battles. Millions died and many returned home shell-shocked by what they had seen. The empire reached its territorial height in 1921 after gaining territory from Germany and the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The empire now ruled over 400 million people and controlled 1/4 of the world's landmass. But the reality was, Britain could no longer afford to build bases.
He's right there, this was the regression. But I think it was around about this time Britain knew that, you know, that the times were changing. Geopolitics actually became a massive thing around about the time of the First World War. It was no longer, things were no longer, how can I say, played with. You know, people were actually getting a lot more serious now in terms of like settling the world down, solidifying territories and solidifying populations, and obviously capitalism was becoming a global thing. You'd had the industrial revolution, so there was people who were becoming millionaires, billionaires even back then. Centralized banking systems were being set up. You know, there was so much that was going on at this time. But through all this, Britain's position at the centre of the world had reached its day. And obviously, post First World War, we still had an empire, but the finances, the control, all the different facets of it had started to dwindle. And then by the post Second World War, you know, the writing was well on the wall by then.
Or ships to defend its empire as it had before 1914. Ireland finally managed to break away from British rule and formed the Irish Free State, and shortly after became a republic. The Second World War was more brutal and horrific than the First. Most of Europe had fallen under German occupation, and under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Britain stood strong during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Britain were extremely successful at intercepting and decoding enemy communications.
Sorry, that Battle of the Blitz. My grandfather, when I was younger, he told me a story once about the sirens went off when he was younger in his area. So they were all come rushing out the house on the way to the air raid shelter, when a bomb dropped and actually blew up one of his friend's house and killed his friend and the family and stuff like that. And it's mad to think, you know, as when you think of the war, you think of the guys in the trenches, you know, think of bombs going off, you think of Pearl Harbor and stuff like that, Normandy. But, you know, these people were trained, prepared and going into conflict. The civilian casualty loss was horrendous really on both sides, trying to beat the other side into submission really, targeting like factories and urban centres. And obviously this is the Enigma machine, which was cracked by Great Britain. But is this technically the first computer, is it? I'm not too sure, but yeah, let's go.
With the likes of Alan Turing, who cracked the German Enigma code. The war ended with an Allied victory, but many nations within the empire felt a desire for independence, and it was clear the empire was about to break. India was one such nation who were ready to declare their independence. Mohandas Gandhi practiced a non-violent approach, and this proved successful, as shortly after India gained independence. The Commonwealth of Nations was formed to improve relations and economic ties with former colonies. This still remains.
Sorry, is that a symbol for the Commonwealth, is it? This globe with all these rays coming out of it? Never seen that symbol before.
The Commonwealth of Nations was formed to improve relations and economic ties with former colonies. This still remains today, with 53 members united by language.
Sorry, just look at that for a visual representation. Look at all the islands that are green as well. It's like, oh, this is a little island. Like Britain's tiny. It's incredible, isn't it? It's basically like Japan. It's like Japan. Well, it's Japan up here somewhere. Yeah, I think Japan's up there, isn't it? It's New Zealand now. It's like, imagine Japan here taking over all of this green, except for Britain. Leave Britain grey, colour Japan in green, and it's like Japan taking over all this. It's amazing.
Language, history, culture, and shared values of democracy. The British Empire officially ended with Hong Kong, Britain's last colony, being handed over to China in 1997. The empire committed many atrocities on many different people, imposing their culture and civilization while often wiping out native ones. On the other hand, this brought about globalization and the uniting of the modern world. And without such innovations and industrialization, the world might have been a very different place. The United Kingdom suffered a small economic recession in 2008, but has since recovered. It is a multicultural society with each region retaining a presence of its history and culture. If you ever visit, look out for the Welsh cake, the haggis, the whiskey, the Chelsea bun, the parmo, the Cumberland sausage, the Yorkshire pudding.
And don't forget, if you come to Liverpool, get yourself a nice pot of scouse, a nice bowl of scouse with a crusty cob.
Or the Cornish pasty. The UK remains a member of NATO, United Nations and the World Trade Organization, and uses the pound currency. In 2016, a referendum resulted in 51.9% of voters in favour to leave the European Union, although the countries within the United Kingdom became divided on the matter, leading to the many questions of its future unity. Thank you for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, like, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, support us on Patreon.
But yeah, so there you go, that's the history of the UK, Great Britain. I was actually fascinated there, you know, there was some things I didn't know, and there was obviously quite a lot of stuff that I did know, because I like my history and things like that. But again, you know, just to close it, I'm just still amazed that such a small nation could have such a large influence on the global stage. And in some ways it makes you really proud to be British, you know, to think of the sense of achievement and stuff like that. But like I say, when you mention things like the slave trade and things like the Boer Wars, where there was an enslavement of civilians, you know, women and children, you know, these are the dark sides of empire. And you know, like I say, it's just a stain on human history, really, and especially British history. We weren't the only nation guilty of it, you know, many nations were, but there's no excuse for it. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it anyway, guys. Sorry if I've rambled on a little bit, but please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.